The federal agent didn't knock. He kicked the door open so hard the hinges screamed, and the sound of it bounced off every wall of Wyatt Holloway's cabin like a gunshot. 12 children flinched as one, a single ripple of terror, moving through small bodies that had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. Agent stepped inside without being invited, his boots tracking mud across the floor. Wyatt had scrubbed that morning, his eyes moving over the children, the way a man counts livestock before a sale. "There they are," he said. Not to Wyatt, to the 2 men standing behind him. "Round them up." Wyatt didn't move from where he stood between the agent and the children. He was a large man, large enough that the agent had to look up to meet his eyes, and he stood very still, the way a mountain stands still when wind hits it. "You touch one of them," Wyatt said quietly, "and I will put you through that wall." The agent smiled. It was the kind of smile that had practiced itself in front of mirrors. "Sir, these children are federal property. Step aside, or I will have you arrested before supper." Behind Wyatt, the youngest girl, she couldn't have been more than 5, reached out and grabbed the back of his shirt with both fists. She didn't make a sound. She just held on. Wyatt felt those small fingers through the fabric and didn't move an inch. If you've ever watched someone try to take something that wasn't theirs, to take something that mattered more than anything you owned, then you already know what was happening inside Wyatt Holloway that afternoon. And if you haven't, stay with this story. Because what happened next in that Montana cabin in the winter of 1887 will stay with you long after the last word. Before we go any further, if stories like this one reach something in you, something real, please take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The winter that year came early and stayed mean. By the second week of November, the passes into the high country were already buried, and the cold that settled over the Holloway Ranch wasn't the kind you got used to. It was the kind that found the gaps in your walls and reminded you that the land didn't care whether you lived or died on it. The land was just land. It had been there before you, and it would be there after. Wyatt Holloway understood that better than most. He was 38 years old, and he had built his ranch with his hands, not with inherited money or borrowed luck, but with 10 years of breaking rock and clearing timber and driving fence posts into ground that didn't want them. The ranch sat on 400 acres of Montana rangeland, backed by a ridge of pines that kept the worst of the north wind off his cattle. He ran 200 head. He had a barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a cabin that was warm enough if you kept the fire fed. He had no one to keep the fire fed with him. His wife Clara had died 4 years before. Not in any dramatic way, no accident, no sudden violence. She had gotten sick in the spring, and by August she was gone, and the baby she'd been carrying had gone with her. Wyatt had buried them together on the east slope of the ridge where the wildflowers came up thick in June. He'd put a stone there that he'd hauled down from the high rocks himself, and he'd carved their names into it with a chisel, and then he'd gone back to work, because that was the only thing he knew how to do with grief. He wasn't a man who talked about what he felt. He wasn't sure he'd know how, even if someone had been around to listen. So he worked. He worked until his hands were cracked and his back ached, and he could fall asleep without thinking too much. Most days, that was enough. Most days. The morning he found the tracks was a Thursday. He was up before light, which was his habit, and he went outside to check on the cattle before the temperature dropped any further. The sky was the color of iron, and the air had that particular stillness that comes before heavy snow. His boots crunched through the crust of ice that had formed overnight on the thin layer of snow from 2 days before. He found the tracks near the woodpile on the north side of the cabin. Small tracks, child-sized, more than one set. They came from the direction of the ridge and stopped about 10 feet from the cabin wall, and then they turned and went back the way they'd come, as if whoever had made them had gotten close enough to see the light in the window and then thought better of it. Wyatt crouched and looked at them for a long time. They were fresh, made sometime after midnight, when the temperature had been well below freezing. He stood up and looked toward the ridge. The pines were dark against the pale sky, and there was nothing moving in them that he could see. But there was something, a feeling he'd had a few times before in his life, the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't sure whether he was a threat or not. He went back inside and ate his breakfast and thought about it. The rational explanation was that someone had passed through, a traveler, maybe, or a family moving between settlements who'd seen his light and come close but decided not to knock. It happened sometimes. People were cautious in the territory. You didn't just walk up to a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night, especially if you were carrying something you needed to protect. Children didn't travel alone. Not in November. Not out here. He went back outside after breakfast with a piece of smoked venison wrapped in cloth, a skin of water, and 2 of the wool blankets he kept folded in the trunk at the foot of his bed. He walked to the wood pile and set them down in a spot that was sheltered from the wind, visible from the tree line. He didn't look toward the pines while he did it. He just set the things down and went back inside and got to work. That night, when he went out to bank the fire in the barn, the food and water were gone. The blankets were still there, folded back up, set neatly on top of the woodpile, as if someone had decided they didn't want to take more than they had to. Wyatt stood there in the dark for a while. Then he went back inside, got 2 more blankets, and added a second piece of venison and a half loaf of bread he'd baked 3 days ago and hadn't finished. He set it all out again and went to bed. He lay awake for a long time listening. Sometime before midnight, he heard the faintest sound of movement outside, so careful it was almost nothing. Creak of snow, a soft sound that might have been breathing. He didn't get up. He stayed where he was and stared at the ceiling and waited. In the morning, everything was gone, including the blankets. Spent the day working and thinking. He wasn't alarmed exactly. He was something more complicated than alarmed. He was aware of something happening at the edge of his life that he didn't have a name for yet. Felt it once before, years ago, when he'd come across a half-frozen deer tangled in old wire fence. The deer had been so frightened it had stopped struggling by the time he found it. It had just looked at him with those dark eyes, exhausted and waiting to see what kind of man he was. Cut it free. Taken him the better part of an hour. On the 3rd morning, he did something different. He left more food than usual this time. He added dried beans in a cloth sack, a wedge of hard cheese, and a tin of molasses he'd been saving. He also left a note, though he wasn't sure why, since he didn't know whether whoever was out there could read. He wrote, "You are safe here. I will not come looking. Come when you are ready." He tucked the note under the tin of molasses and went inside. He watched from the window. He stood to one side of the glass so he wouldn't be visible from the outside. And he watched the woodpile and he waited. He waited for 2 hours, which was longer than he'd stood still in recent memory. His coffee went cold. His feet got stiff. He didn't move. It was the small one who came first. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. She was wearing clothes that were too big for her, a man's coat that hung to her knees, trousers rolled up at the ankles multiple times over, boots that were at least 3 sizes too large and stuffed with what looked like dried grass to keep them on her feet. She came out of the trees at the edge of the ridge with the careful sideways movement of someone who had learned that the open ground was the most dangerous kind. She stopped at the woodpile and picked up the tin of molasses and the cloth sack and the cheese. She didn't touch the note. Then she looked directly at the cabin window. Couldn't see him. He was sure of it. But she looked at the window for a long moment anyway, as if she was trying to decide something. Then she tucked the food under her coat and turned back toward the trees. And stopped. Because something had shifted in the trees, and a boy had appeared at the edge of them, older, maybe 13 or 14, broad-shouldered for his age, with a face that had gone very still and watchful. He was looking at Wyatt's window, too. Then he looked at the small girl and said something quiet that Wyatt couldn't hear through the glass. The girl hesitated. Then she turned back around, walked to the woodpile, and picked up the note, carried it to the boy. He took it from her, read it, and stood there for a long time with it in his hand. Wyatt didn't move. The boy folded the note carefully and put it inside his coat. Then he did something that Wyatt had not expected. Put his hand flat on the small girl's back and turned her gently back toward the trees. But before he followed her, he turned one more time toward the cabin. He gave a single short nod. Wyatt didn't know what it meant exactly. It wasn't gratitude quite. It was something more guarded than that, more like an acknowledgement between two people who had each decided the other wasn't an immediate threat. It was the kind of nod you gave across a distance when words weren't safe yet. Wyatt nodded back, even though the boy probably couldn't see him. That evening, Wyatt cooked twice as much as he usually did. He carried a pot of venison stew outside and set it near the woodpile, still hot, with a stack of tin bowls he didn't need anymore. He went back inside and waited. He didn't hear them come. But when he checked in the morning, every bowl had been used, and they'd been washed with snow and stacked back the way he'd left them. Every one of them. 12 bowls. He stood there counting them twice, and both times he got 12, and he looked up at the ridge and thought about that number for a long time. 12 meant more than he'd imagined. 12 meant someone out there had been keeping track of every single one of them. Spent the rest of the morning in the barn, working, and in the afternoon he walked out to the tree line, for the first time not up into the pines, just to the edge, where the trees started. He crouched down and looked at the ground there. Dozens of small footprints, overlapping and careful, like the ground had been used for watching. And then, behind him, very quietly, a voice said, "We're starving, sir." Turned slowly, because sudden movements were the wrong thing. The small girl was standing 6 feet away from him. She was looking at him with eyes that were too tired for her age, and her face was thin in a way that made something in his chest go tight and unpleasant. She had a stick in her hand, not as a weapon, just something she'd picked up, and she was holding it the way children hold things when they need something to do with their hands. Behind her, at a distance, the older boy stood watching. Wyatt stayed crouched so he wouldn't tower over her. He kept his hands visible. "I know," he said. She blinked. Probably been expecting something different, questions, maybe. Or demands. "Not that. You left the food," she said. "I did." She thought about this. Why? It was a fair question. Wyatt considered it the way he considered most things honestly, without decoration. "Because it was cold," he said, "and I had food." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the older boy. Some kind of silent communication passed between them, the kind that only develops between people who've spent a long time surviving together. The boy's expression didn't change, but after a moment, he walked forward and stood beside the girl. "Ethan Red Wolf," he said. His voice was steady for someone his age, and his eyes were direct. Not challenging, but not deferential either. Just looking. "Wyatt Holloway," Wyatt said. "This is my land." "I know." "How long have you been up in those pines?" Ethan looked at the girl, then back at Wyatt. 11 days. 11 days in November, with 12 children. Wyatt stood up slowly. He was aware of how large he looked to them. He had always been big, and he'd never been entirely comfortable with the way it affected people who didn't know him yet. He took a step back, putting a little more distance between them. "Are any of them hurt?" he asked. "Two have bad feet," Ethan said. "From the cold. And the little ones." He stopped. "They haven't had a real meal in a while." "How long is a while?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "A week, maybe more." Wyatt looked at the small girl with the stick. She was watching him with the same careful, measuring attention she'd shown at the window. She was 5 years old, and she was trying to decide if he was going to hurt her. He'd seen that look on the deer in the wire fence. He'd seen it on cattle brought in from a bad season. He'd never expected to see it on a child's face, and the seeing of it did something to him that he would not have been able to explain. "Come inside," he said. "All of you. There's stew on the stove." Neither of them moved right away. "I'm not a threat to you," Wyatt said. "You already know that, or you wouldn't be standing here." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned toward the pines and gave a single low whistle. They came out of the trees slowly, one by one, the way deer emerge from cover hesitant, ready to bolt, watching everything. Some were older, some barely walking age. A few were holding hands. Two of the older ones were carrying the youngest between them in a makeshift slings. They were all wearing mismatched clothing that was either too large or too worn, and they were all thin in the way that meant they'd been managing hunger for weeks, not days. Wyatt counted them. 12. Exactly, 12. They stood at the edge of the tree line looking at him, and he stood in the open looking at them, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then the small girl, the one who'd spoken first, walked forward past Wyatt toward the cabin, as if the decision had already been made, and she was just the first one willing to act on it. The others followed her. Wyatt fell into step behind them and opened his door. His cabin had never held 12 people before. It had never held more than 2. But they filed inside and arranged themselves in the small space with a kind of practiced efficiency that told him they were used to making the best of whatever they had. The older ones went to the walls. The younger ones went toward the stove, drawn by the heat, the way cold things always move toward warmth. The girl with the stick sat down on the floor, directly in front of the stove, and held her hands out to it. The stiffness in her face softened for the first time, and for just a moment, only a moment, she looked exactly like what she was. A small cold child who had been frightened for too long. Wyatt went to the stove and started ladling stew into bowls without asking anyone what they wanted. He put a bowl in front of each child, and they took them with both hands and ate without speaking. Not frantically, that was the thing that stayed with him afterward. They ate carefully, like people who'd learned that eating too fast after going hungry made you sick. Ethan watched the younger ones while he ate, making sure no one took more than their share, making sure the smallest ones got their bowls refilled first. Wyatt watched all of this and didn't say anything. When the pot was empty and the bowls were set down, a silence settled over the room, not uncomfortable, just full. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the cold pressed against the windows. And inside his cabin, it was warm for the first time in a long time. Ethan looked up from across the room and met Wyatt's eyes. "You're going to want to know why," he said. "When you're ready," Wyatt said, the right thing to say. He could tell by the slight shift in Ethan's posture, not quite relaxation, but something adjacent to it. The wariness didn't leave the boy's face, but it moved back a step. "Tonight," Ethan said. "I'll tell you tonight." Wyatt nodded. He got up and put more wood on the fire. Then he went to the trunk at the foot of his bed and pulled out every blanket. He had 7 of them, and brought them to the room without comment. He left them in a pile and went back to his chair. The youngest children were already asleep against each other, sharing warmth the way animals do in cold weather. The older ones sat with their backs to the walls, still watchful, but with the particular quality of watchfulness that belonged to people who had decided they were not in immediate danger. It was a different kind of watchfulness than what they'd had at the tree line. Less like prey and more like soldiers resting between positions. Wyatt looked at them all 12 of them in his cabin, in the firelight, breathing. He thought about Clara. He thought about the stone on the ridge. He thought about 4 years of mornings that had been so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat. He did not know yet what any of this would cost him. He did not know about the federal agents or the courthouse or what it meant to stand between the law and something you'd decided was worth more than the law. Both. He didn't know that his life was about to become something unrecognizable from what it had been. But he looked at those 12 children, and something shifted in his chest, something that had been frozen, and still for a long time, and he understood, without being able to say it in words, that whatever came next, he was not going to send them back out into the cold. Not tonight. Not ever. Ethan talked that night the way someone talks when they've been holding something heavy for too long and their arms have finally given out. He didn't do it dramatically. He sat across from Wyatt with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up and his voice low enough that the sleeping children wouldn't wake. And he told it the way it had happened in pieces. without decoration, with the particular flatness of someone who had already cried about it and come out the other side, of crying into something harder and quieter. They had come from 3 different families, he said, not all related. Some were cousins, some were neighbors' children, some were children of families that had been moving through the territory when everything fell apart. What had fallen apart was not one single thing, but a series of things stacked on top of each other the way a bad season stacks itself. One problem, and then another, until the weight of all of them together becomes something that can't be carried anymore. There had been a settlement, not large, not official, not on any map that the territorial government had ever cared about. Families who had been pushed off better land and had found this patch of high country and had been making it work for 3 years. They'd built structures, cleared fields, kept animals. They'd done what people do when they're determined to stay somewhere. They'd made it into something that mattered. Then the men came. Wyatt didn't ask who sent them, and Ethan didn't say. What he said was that they came in winter, when the ground was hard and the options were few, and they came with papers that nobody in the settlement could properly read. And they told the adults that the land had been reclassified, and the structures had to come down, and the people had to go. Go where? Wyatt asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's what my father asked. He didn't say what happened after that question was asked. He didn't have to. The way he stopped talking said enough. The adults had been taken. That was the word Ethan used, taken, and he used it the way you use a word when all the other words are too large to hold. The children had scattered into the pines and watched from the ridge, and then, when there was nothing left to watch for, they had kept moving, because stopping felt more dangerous than moving. 11 days. 11 days of cold and hunger, and the oldest among them 14 years old, barely making decisions that no 14-year-old should ever have to make. Wyatt sat with all of this for a while. How many of them know, he asked, about their parents? Ethan looked at the sleeping children. Firelight moved over their faces. The older ones know something bad happened. The little ones, he paused. I told them we were on a trip. Their families were meeting us somewhere. How long can you keep telling them that? Ethan's jaw tightened. It was the expression of someone who had already asked himself that question many times and hadn't found an answer he could live with yet. I don't know. Wyatt nodded slowly. He looked at the fire for a while. Then he looked at Ethan. You did well, he said, keeping them alive. That was hard work. Ethan said nothing. But something shifted in his face. Not gratitude, exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been carrying a thing alone and has just been told, for the first time, that they were right to carry it. It didn't make the carrying easier. It just made it feel less like madness. Some sleep, Wyatt said. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. He wasn't sure that was true. But it was the right thing to say. And sometimes, the right thing to say and the true thing are not the same thing. And a person has to decide which one matters more in a given moment. He slept in his chair that night, leaving his bed empty, in case any of the children needed it. None of them took it. They slept in a pile near the stove, arranged by some instinct toward shared warmth, the smaller ones in the center, the older ones at the edges. Ethan slept last and woke first, which Wyatt noticed and said nothing about. The next morning was the beginning of something that Wyatt did not have a word for yet. He made a breakfast large enough for 14 people, which required him to open a second sack of flour and use nearly all the eggs he'd been saving. The children ate at his table in shifts. There wasn't room for all of them. At once in a while they ate. They were quiet in the way of people who are not yet sure of the rules of a new place. Few of the younger ones watched him with the open, undisguised curiosity that very small children have before they learn that staring is impolite. He ignored the staring. He wasn't offended by it. Curiosity he could work with. After breakfast, he took stock of the situation, the way he took stock of anything practically without sentiment. He had 12 children in his cabin. 2 of them had feet damaged by cold that needed to be looked at properly. All of them needed warmer clothes than they had. He had food enough for himself through the winter, but not enough for 12 additional people. which meant a supply run to Halter Creek, the nearest town, was now urgent rather than optional. He also had a ranch to run, cattle to feed, water lines to check, 100 tasks that didn't stop requiring attention just because his life had suddenly become unrecognizable. He said none of this out loud. He just started working. The first thing he did was look at the 2 children with bad feet. One was a girl of about 8 named Mara, and one was a boy of 10 or 11 whose name was James, and who was determined not to show that anything was wrong with him. Wyatt had to be patient with James, which didn't come naturally to him. He was not a patient man by instinct, only by practice, and eventually got the boy to sit down long enough to look at his feet properly. The damage wasn't as bad as it could have been. Cold bitten, swollen with a few places that had started to blister and crack. Painful, certainly, but not the kind of damage that took toes. He cleaned and wrapped both sets of feet with strips of clean cloth from a shirt he didn't need anymore and told them to stay off the cold ground as much as possible. Mara thanked him very solemnly. James said nothing, but he looked at the wrapped feet afterward with an expression that Wyatt recognized as. It was the expression of someone who had been trying not to think about how much something hurt and was only now, problem addressed, allowing themselves to feel it. "It'll be sore for a few days," Wyatt told him. "Then it'll get better." James nodded once, the way boys that age nod when they're trying to look like they already knew that. By mid-morning, Wyatt had assessed what he was dealing with in terms of ages. The youngest was 4, a girl named Nora, who had not yet said a word to him, but who not yet a word to him, with her eyes wherever tracking his movements with the solemn attention of someone performing a very important job. The oldest after Ethan was a girl of 12 named Sarah, who had a sharp, watchful face and who Wyatt clocked immediately as someone who didn't miss much. The rest fell in between a range of ages from 4 to 12, a mix of boys and girls, all of them carrying that particular quality of children who have been through something and have not yet had the time or safety to process it. He sent Ethan with him to the barn that morning. Not because he needed the help, though. The help was useful, but because he had the sense that Ethan needed to do something with his hands. The boy was wound tight in the way of people who've been in charge of something dangerous for a long time and don't know how to stop being in charge. Work was a kind of release valve. Wyatt knew that from his own experience. They fed the cattle in silence for a while. Ethan worked without being told what to do. He watched what Wyatt did and did the same, which told Wyatt something about the boy's intelligence and something about his upbringing. "You've worked with animals before," Wyatt said. "My father kept horses," Ethan said, "and some cattle." Wyatt nodded. He forked another load of hay down from the loft. "You know how to ride?" "Yes." "Good." He didn't explain why that was good. He was already thinking about the supply run to Halter Creek and whether Ethan was old enough and steady enough to stay in charge of the cabin while he was gone. He was thinking about how much he could carry back on 2 horses and whether it would be enough. He was thinking about 11 things at once, which was unusual. For him, he was generally a man who thought about one thing at a time, and the unusual quality of his thinking told him something about how much had changed in the last 16 hours. He went to Halter Creek the next day. He went alone, which he'd considered carefully. Taking Ethan would leave the younger children with no one capable in charge, and bringing any of them along to town seemed like the wrong kind of risk. He left before dawn, rode hard, and was in Halter Creek by mid-morning. Halter Creek was not a large town. It had a general store, a feed merchant, a blacksmith, a small hotel that also served as a saloon, and about 400 residents who knew each other's business with the thoroughness that comes from proximity and limited entertainment. Wyatt had been buying supplies there for 10 years. The man behind the counter at the general store was named Cord Hallis, and he was a heavy-set man with pale eyes who had sold Wyatt everything from lamp oil to flour to the occasional luxury item, and had never once asked him anything personal. He asked something personal this time. "You buying for someone else?" Cord said, watching the size of Wyatt's order grow. "You're getting twice what you usually get." "Weather's bad," Wyatt said. Rather have too much than not enough. Cord looked at him for a moment. Then he started filling the order without further comment. He was a man who understood that some questions weren't being answered and that pressing wasn't worth the trouble. It was at the feed merchant that Wyatt ran into Vernon Creel. Creel was a man Wyatt had no fondness for. He ran a small operation about 8 miles east of Wyatt's ranch, and he had a habit of standing in a way that suggested he thought he owned whatever ground he was standing on. He was the kind of man who made his opinions known without being asked for them, and his opinions were generally the kind that made other people tired. Holloway, Creel said, looking at the supplies Wyatt was loading. That's a lot of provisions for a man living alone. I'm aware of what I'm loading, Wyatt said. Creel tilted his head. He had the look of a man turning something over in his mind. Heard something interesting this morning. Apparently, there's a search on for some Indian children who went missing up in the high country. Government's looking for them. Wyatt continued loading. He didn't change his pace. He didn't look at Creel. Right, he said. Not a question. 12 of them, they're saying. Creel paused. Odd number. Someone would remember seeing a group like that. Someone might, Wyatt agreed. He finished loading, tied the packs, and walked his horse out of the feed yard without looking back at Creel. He could feel the man watching him go. Creel was the kind of man who filed things away, information, observations, suspicions, and used them later when they became useful. Wyatt had known men like that his whole life. The knowing didn't make them less dangerous. He rode home faster than he'd ridden into town. When he got back to the ranch, he found the situation in the cabin more or less as he'd left it, which was a relief. Sarah had organized the younger children into what looked like a cleaning effort. She'd swept the floor and had them washing their faces with the water he kept in the barrel near the stove. Ethan was outside, and when Wyatt rode in, he came to help unload without being asked. Any trouble? Wyatt said. No, Ethan said. Then Nora talked. Wyatt looked up. Yeah? She said. Your cabin smells like pine trees. Ethan's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to one. She meant it as a compliment, I think. Tell her she's right, Wyatt said. It does. They unloaded in silence. When they were done, Wyatt stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the ridge. Then he told Ethan what Creel had said in town. He said it plainly, without softening it, because Ethan was 14 and had earned plain speech. Ethan's face went very still. How soon? I don't know. Creel might say nothing. Might say something just to see what happens. Either way, we need to think about what we're doing here and how we're doing it. Ethan looked at him directly. You could tell us to leave. I could, Wyatt said. Neither of them spoke for a moment. You're not going to, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. No, Wyatt said. I'm not. That was the moment things became real, in a way they hadn't quite been before. Not when Wyatt had found the tracks. Not when he'd left the food out. Not even when he'd opened his door and let 12 children in out of the cold. The moment things became real was standing in the yard in the gray November light, saying no to the easiest exit available to him and meaning it. He went inside and started putting the provisions away and began thinking about what came next. What came next turned out to be more complicated than he'd expected, which he should have expected but didn't, because complicated things usually surprised him even when they shouldn't. The first complication was practical. 12 children could not live in one room with one adult man indefinitely without a set of arrangements that made sense. Wyatt's cabin had one main room, a sleeping area partitioned off by a curtain, and a small storage space at the back. This was not enough. He started work on an expansion the following week. 2 additional rooms attached to the existing structure, one for the older children and one for the younger. He worked on it in the mornings before the light got good and in the evenings after the cattle were settled. Ethan helped, and 2 of the older boys, 12-year-old Dylan and 13-year-old Clay, turned out to be useful with a hammer once he showed them what he needed done. Construction was loud and visible, which was a problem. But the cold was also visible, and the cold was a more immediate problem than the visibility. So Wyatt made his decision and hammered nails and told himself he'd manage the other thing when it arrived. The second complication was the town. He'd hoped that Creel would decide discretion was the better choice. He should have known better. 2 weeks after his supply run, he went back to Halter Creek for lamp oil and nails, and the quality of the silence in the general store told him that Cord Hallis had heard something. Cord was not unfriendly. He wasn't the kind of man who made things dramatic, but there was a carefulness to his manner that hadn't been there before, a deliberateness in how he looked at Wyatt that said he was working something out. 3 other men in town that day found reasons to stand near Wyatt while he was loading his horse. None of them said anything directly, but the things they didn't say were louder than anything they might have. On his way out of town, a man named Aldous Bream caught up with him on the road. Bream was a local council member, not an official government post, just the kind of man who liked to be in the middle of things. He was not a bad man, Wyatt thought. He was a cautious man, which was sometimes the same thing and sometimes worse. Wyatt, Bream said, pulling his horse alongside. I'll speak plainly. Go ahead, Wyatt said. There's talk about what you've got at your place. We'll talk. This kind of talk brings attention, Bream said. Kept his voice neutral. Not threatening, just informational. The way a man tells you the bridge is out before you ride into a flooded river. The federal agents who've been through here asking questions aren't the casual kind. They're the kind that write things down and send them places. Wyatt kept writing. What are you telling me, Aldous? Bream was quiet for a moment. I'm telling you to think carefully about your situation. I've been thinking about it. There are people in town who think you should send them on. There are people in town who think a lot of things. Bream sighed. It was the sigh of a man who had tried the reasonable approach and was watching it go nowhere. Wyatt, be sensible. Your ranch, your cattle, are my concern, Wyatt said. Thank you, Aldous. He rode on ahead and Bream didn't follow. He told himself on the ride home that he wasn't angry. He wasn't, quite. He understood Bream's position. He understood the town's position. He even understood Creel's, in a way men like Creel acted from self-interest so consistently that they'd convinced themselves self-interest was the same as sense. Wyatt understood all of it, and it didn't move him. What moved him was something that had happened 3 days before his supply run, something he hadn't been able to stop thinking about. He'd been repairing a section of fence on the north side of the property, and Nora had followed him out. She'd taken to following him in the mornings, staying close without getting underfoot, watching everything he did with that solemn, tracking attention of hers. He'd let her come along because she wasn't any trouble, and because he'd started to find the company of a 4-year-old less strange, expat strain than he'd expected. He was working the fence wire when she said, very quietly, "Is this your home?" "It is," he said. She considered this. "It can be our home too?" He stopped what he was doing. He looked at her, the too big coat, the serious eyes, the stick she was carrying again, because she'd found a new one, after the first one got lost somewhere. "Yes," he said. It came out without hesitation, which surprised him a little. She nodded, as if this had confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she sat down in the snow and waited for him to finish the fence. And that was all she said about it. But it was enough. It was more than enough. That one question from a 4-year-old had settled something in him that 100 reasonable arguments from Aldous Bream couldn't unsettle. The weeks that followed were hard in the practical sense and easier in some other sense that he didn't have a name for. The 2 additional rooms took shape slowly, and when they were done enough to be habitable, the children moved into them with the same efficient adaptation they brought to everything, arranging blankets and the few belongings they had, with a practicality that made Wyatt feel, not for the first time, that these children had been underestimated by the world in ways that the world would eventually regret. He started teaching them ranch work, not as a distraction, but because the ranch needed working, and they were there, and some of them were old enough to contribute, and also because work was the thing he knew how to give. He showed Ethan the cattle rotation and the water line maintenance. He showed Dylan and Clay how to muck the barn properly and how to tell when an animal was off his feed. He showed Sarah, who turned out to have a steady hand and a good eye, how to check the chickens for egg production and spot signs of illness in the flock. The younger ones he assigned lighter tasks, gathering kindling, keeping the wood box full, carrying water from the well. Nora, who was still too small for most things, was given the job of watching the bread when it was in the oven, which she took extremely seriously and performed without ever letting anything burn. He didn't tell them this was their home now formally, with words. He showed them instead, which was the only way he knew how to say things that mattered. He fixed James's boots when they started separating at the sole. He sourced extra wool from a sheep farmer 2 valleys over and had Sarah help him cut and sew it into coats, rough enough to keep out the cold. He made a chess set out of scraps of wood because Ethan had mentioned once, in passing, that his father had played, and Wyatt had figured out that the boy needed something to do in the evenings besides worry. Played chess badly, both of them, and argued about the rules, and it was the closest thing to comfortable that either of them had managed yet. December moved into January, and January settled over the ranch with the particular heaviness of deep winter in Montana, the kind of cold that makes the world very small and very quiet and focuses everything down to the immediate: food, heat, the cattle, the children. One day at a time, Wyatt stopped going into Halter Creek as often, partly because the roads were worse, and partly because he'd noticed that each trip brought a new layer of tension back with him, and he was already managing enough tension without importing more. He sent Ethan just once, to pick up a single specific item from Cord Hallis, and when Ethan came back, his face was tight in a way it hadn't been when he left. People stared, Ethan said. "They'll do that," Wyatt said. One man followed me to the horse. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Did he say anything? He told me I should go back where I came from. Ethan set the package on the table. His hands were steady, but his jaw was clenched in a way that showed the steadiness was costing him something. I didn't say anything back. That was the right call. I know. Ethan looked up. It didn't feel right. It rarely does, Wyatt said. He didn't tell Ethan the rest of what he was thinking, that the man following him to the horse was a problem, not because of what was said, but because of what it represented. Things were moving in town. People were talking, deciding, aligning. Creel had not kept quiet as Wyatt had suspected he wouldn't, and the story that was circulating in Halter Creek was probably not the version Wyatt would have chosen to tell. He started keeping the rifle closer to the door. He also started writing things down. This was a new habit, and not a comfortable one. He was not a man who kept records, who documented, who trusted paper over memory. But something Ethan had said early on had stayed with him, about the papers the men had brought to the settlement, the papers that nobody could properly read. Documents mattered in ways that fairness shouldn't require them to matter, but did. So Wyatt wrote down dates. He wrote down what he'd done and why. He wrote down the condition of each child when they arrived, and what he'd done to address it. He wrote it carefully, in his least terrible handwriting, and he kept the pages folded inside the cover of the ranch ledger where they'd be found if someone came looking. He wasn't sure what he thought any of it would accomplish. He was not a lawyer. He had no illusions about what the law thought of men like him who made unilateral decisions about things the government considered its business. But the writing felt like something he could do, and doing something was better than waiting. The night it finally broke open, it was February. He'd been in the barn. Late, one of the cows was showing signs of difficulty, and he'd been up with her for most of the night when he heard horses on the road. More than one. Moving at a pace that wasn't casual. He stood very still in the barn and listened. 3 horses, maybe 4, coming from the direction of Halter Creek. He went to the barn door and looked out. The moon was out, and the snow reflected it, so visibility was better than it had any right to be. He could see them at the end of the approach road, 4 riders moving at a steady trot, not hurrying but not dawdling either. In the moonlight, he could see the shapes of their coats, the way they sat in the saddle. Not local ranch hands. Not travelers. He went back across the yard to the cabin. Inside, Ethan was awake. The boy slept. lightly, which was a habit of people who'd had to stay alert through the night too many times. He was sitting up in the sleeping area with the younger children around him, and when he saw Wyatt's face, he stood immediately. "How many?" Ethan said. "4. On the road." The other older children, Sarah, Dylan, Clay, were awake now too. The younger ones were stirring. Nora opened her eyes and looked at Wyatt and didn't say anything, just pulled her blanket tighter. "Listen to me," Wyatt said. He kept his voice low and level. "Nobody goes outside. Nobody makes noise. Whatever happens, you stay in here and you stay quiet, and you keep the little ones calm. Can you do that?" Ethan looked at him steadily. "Yes." Sarah, she looked at him. "You're in charge of the younger ones if Ethan needs to be elsewhere. You understand?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. 12 years old. Wyatt went to the door. He took his rifle from beside it and then thought about it and put the rifle back. Showing up at his own door with a rifle wasn't going to help anything. He'd face whatever was coming, as a man standing in his own doorway, not a man bracing for a fight. He went outside and stood on the step and waited. The 4 riders came into the yard and stopped their horses. In the moonlight, he could see the brass buttons on their coats, the authority in the way they sat. The man in front was perhaps 40, with a weathered face, and the particular expression of someone who'd been doing an unpleasant job for a long time, and had made his peace with its unpleasantness. "Wyatt Holloway," the man said. "That's me," Wyatt said. "My name is Agent Dale Forsyth, Federal Indian Affairs." He held up a piece of paper, though Wyatt couldn't read it in the dark from where he stood. "We have reason to believe you are harboring minors who are under federal jurisdiction. We are authorized to take custody of said minors and to detain any individual who impedes that process." Wyatt stood in the cold and looked at them. The barn behind him was quiet. Inside the cabin, 12 children were being held together by a 14-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl who had not asked for any of this and deserved better than all of it. 2 in the morning, Wyatt said. Forsyth blinked. It was not the response he'd prepared for. "I beg your pardon? It's 2 in the morning, Wyatt said again. "Whatever business you think you have, here can wait until daylight." He looked at each of the 4 riders in turn. "My door is not open to anyone at 2 in the morning. Not government agents. Not anybody." Forsyth looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the men beside him. Then he looked back at Wyatt. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Holloway." "I'm not negotiating," Wyatt said. "I'm telling you that you'll do this in the daylight, or you won't do it at all. And if you try to push past me tonight, you'll find out very quickly that being a federal agent doesn't make you any larger than you already are." He said it without raising his voice, without threatening. It was simply a statement of fact. The way you state a fact about weather or ground conditions here is how things are. Take it or leave it. The silence stretched out. The horses shifted in the cold. Forsyth looked at Wyatt Holloway, all 6 feet 3 inches of him, standing in his doorway in the middle of a Montana winter night, with no weapon and no sign of backing down. And something shifted in the agent's calculation. "First light," Forsyth said finally. "We'll be back at first light." "I'll be here," Wyatt said. He stood in the doorway until they'd turned their horses and ridden back down the approach road. He stood there after they were gone, in the cold, listening to the hoofbeats fade. Then he went inside, set his back against the closed door, and looked at the 14 pairs of eyes watching him from across the room. "It's all right," he said. He didn't know if it was true. "Get some sleep." Nobody slept. He sat in his chair, and the children sat in their places, and the fire burned it down, and they all waited for morning to come. And outside, the Montana winter held the ranch in its cold grip and didn't care one way or another what any of them decided to do about it. Morning came the way bad things often do, slowly, and then all at once. The fire had burned down to coals by the time the sky outside the windows shifted from black to the particular gray that came before actual light. Wyatt had not slept. He knew this because he had been aware of every hour of the night, had felt each one pass through him like cold water. The children had drifted in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep, more like the shallow, restless unconsciousness of bodies that were exhausted, but couldn't fully let go. Ethan had stayed awake. Wyatt had watched him from the chair, and Ethan had watched the door, and neither of them had spoken because there was nothing left to say that the night hadn't already covered. At some point before dawn, Nora had gotten up from her blankets and crossed the room and climbed into Wyatt's lap without asking permission. She was a small, solid weight. She tucked her head against his chest and was asleep within 2 minutes. He sat very still so as not to wake her, one large hand resting on her back, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing. He looked at the door and thought about what was coming through it. He had bought one night. That was all, and the night was gone. When the gray outside brightened enough to call itself dawn, he shifted Nora carefully back to her blankets and stood up. His back ached from the chair, and his eyes were gritty, and his mind had that particular clarity that comes from a sleepless night when the stakes are high enough to burn through the fog of tiredness. He put more wood on the fire. He put water on for coffee. He did these things because they were the things you did in the morning, and doing them was a way of telling himself and everyone else that he was not a man who had lost his steadiness overnight. Ethan appeared at his shoulder. They'll come soon. Yes. What's going to happen? Wyatt poured the water and didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about Forsyth, about the man's face in the moonlight, the calculation he'd seen there when Wyatt had refused to back down. Forsyth was not a stupid man. Stupid men didn't get sent to do complicated jobs in remote territories. He'd pushed back last night because last night had been the wrong ground for what he needed to do, and he'd recognized it. This morning would be different. They're going to come in, and they're going to make demands, Wyatt said Zed, and I'm going to have to decide how I answer them. And us? Wyatt looked at him. You stay inside, all of you. Whatever happens out there, you do not come outside unless I tell you to. Can you hold to that? Ethan's face was controlled in the way it got when he was managing something difficult. Yes, the little ones. I'll handle the little ones. Wyatt believed him. He'd believed Ethan from early on. There was something in the boy that was worth trusting, some core of steadiness that had been tested hard and had held. Didn't make him feel better about what was comings, but it was one less thing to worry about, and this morning he was counting those carefully. He drank his coffee standing at the window, watching the approach road. He'd gotten through half the cup when he saw them. Not 4 riders this time, 6. Forsyth in front, the same 4 from the night before, and a 6th man Wyatt didn't recognize smaller, wearing a different style of coat, carrying a leather satchel across his body. A lawyer, maybe, or a government clerk. Someone who carried papers and knew what to do with them, which was its own kind of weapon. Wyatt set down his coffee cup and went outside. He stood on the step and waited. He'd made a decision. Sometime in the dark hours, he was not going to be angry. Anger was easy, and it was useless, and it would give Forsyth exactly the kind of situation he wanted, the kind that justified force. Wyatt was going to be the calmest man in the yard. He was going to be so calm that it made everyone else uncomfortable. Forsyth pulled up his horse and looked down at him with the expression of a man who had slept, eaten breakfast, and arrived prepared. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "we'd like to come inside." "You're welcome to step down," Wyatt said. "The men who aren't essential to this conversation can wait in the yard." Forsyth considered this. Then he dismounted and gestured to the man with the satchel, who dismounted as well. The other 4 stayed on their horses. Forsyth and the clerk came to the step. Wyatt stepped aside and held the door. When they came through, 12 children were sitting in the room, arranged along the walls, on the floor, in the 2 chairs that weren't Wyatt's, with the particular stillness of people who had been told to be still and understood why. Ethan was standing near the back of the room, with his arms at his sides and his face completely neutral. Forsyth stopped just inside the door and looked at them all. Something moved across his face. Wyatt wasn't sure what exactly. Not surprise, because the man had been told they were here. Something else, something. Something that might have been the gap between hearing 12 children described in a report and actually standing in a room with 12 actual children looking back at you. Brief something. Then the professional expression closed back over it. "Good morning," Forsyth said to the room. He had a careful voice when he used it on children. Wyatt noticed not unkind, but practiced. The voice of a man who did this more than occasionally. None of the children answered him. The clerk opened his satchel and produced a folder of papers. He set them on Wyatt's table and arranged them with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "Mr. Holloway," Forsyth said, turning, "I need to be clear with you about where things stand legally. Go ahead. Children are under the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, under the act of he named a year, and a piece of legislation that meant very little to Wyatt, but clearly meant a great deal to Forsyth, which authorizes the federal government to take charge of displaced indigenous minors and place them in appropriate supervised facilities. What you have done here, whatever your intentions, constitutes interference with that authority. I found 12 children half dead in my pine trees in November," Wyatt said. "I gave them food and shelter. You concealed their whereabouts from federal minors." "I didn't conceal anything. Nobody asked me." "Mr. Holloway, nobody asked me," Wyatt said again, in the same even tone. "I didn't receive any inquiry from your office. No one came to my door with questions. If they had, I would have answered them. I'm answering you now." Forsyth paused. He looked at the clerk, who was writing something down. Then he looked back at Wyatt. "The children need to come with us," he said. "That's the bottom line." "Where?" Wyatt asked. "There are facilities." "Where?" he asked again. Forsyth's jaw tightened slightly. "There are federally operated facilities for displaced indigenous children. They receive education, meals, structured." "Where are they?" "The nearest placement would be in—" He named a city that was 300 miles away. The room was very quiet. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, one of the horses shifted and stamped. 300 miles, Wyatt said. "That is correct." "In the middle of February. The transfer would be my—" "These children have been through enough," Wyatt said. The evenness in his voice was starting to cost him something. He could feel it, the effort of keeping the anger tamped down, of not letting it show in his face or his hands. 2 of them had cold, damaged feet when they arrived. The youngest is 4 years old. They've been surviving without adults for weeks. And you want to put them on a transport in February and take them 300 miles from the only shelter they've had in months. "I want to place them in proper care," Forsyth said, "which is what the law requires." "The law," Wyatt said, "yes." The words sat in the room between them. Wyatt looked at the clerk, who had stopped writing and was looking at the children with an expression he was trying not to have. He looked at Forsyth. He looked at Nora, who was sitting against the far wall, holding her stick in both hands, watching the 2 strangers in the room with dark, steady eyes. "These children are not going anywhere today," Wyatt said. Forsyth's eyes sharpened. "Mr. Holloway, I am authorized to—" "You're authorized to do a lot of things," Wyatt said. "So am I on my own property." He looked at Forsyth directly. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm a rancher. But I know enough to know that you need more than authority to take children from a man's home. You need a judge's order. Do you have one?" Forsyth said nothing. "Do you have one?" Wyatt asked again. The clerk was looking at his papers. Then he looked at Forsyth with an expression that answered the question without words. "We can obtain one," Forsyth said. "Then obtain one," Wyatt said. "Come back when you have it. Until then, these children stay where they are." Silence stretched out longer this time. He hadn't known, going into the conversation, whether the legal question was real or a bluff. He'd spent part of the night turning it over in his mind, the written notes he'd been keeping, the things Ethan had told him, the things he half remembered from the few legal disputes he'd witnessed in 10 years of frontier life. It had seemed like a plausible thing to say. He hadn't been entirely sure it was accurate. By the look on Forsyth's face, it was accurate enough. The agent picked up the papers from the table and handed them back to the clerk. Then he looked at Wyatt one more time, and the look was not angry. Exactly. It was the look of a man recalculating, adjusting his timeline, deciding that this problem was going to take longer than he'd planned. "This isn't finished," Forsyth said. "I know," Wyatt said. He walked them to the door. He stood on the step and watched them mount and ride, back down the approach road. 6 horses this time, moving at a controlled pace that said they were not retreating, they were repositioning. When they were gone, he stood outside alone for a moment. His hands were shaking. He hadn't noticed until now the conversation had required everything he had, and now that it was done, his body was catching up with what his mind had been managing. He pressed his palms flat against the door frame and breathed until the shaking stopped. Then he went inside. Ethan was looking at him. That was the right answer? About the judge's order? Apparently, Wyatt said. How long do we have? I don't know. Days, maybe. A week if we're lucky. He looked around the room at 12 faces waiting. However long it is, we need to use it. He sat down at the table and looked at the papers he'd been keeping in the ledger cover. Then he made a decision he'd been circling around. For days he had to go back to Halter Creek, and this time he needed to talk to someone he hadn't yet talked to. There was a man in Halter Creek named August Reeves. He was not a practicing lawyer, he'd been one, somewhere east, years ago, before something had brought him to the territory and left him there, running a small printing business. He was a quiet man, unobtrusive, the kind of person a town like Halter Creek didn't pay much attention to. But Wyatt had spoken to him a handful of times over the years, and had come away from each conversation with the distinct impression that there was considerably more going on behind the man's eyes than the printing business suggested. He rode to Halter Creek alone, fast, and went directly to the print shop without stopping anywhere else. The bell above the door announced him. Reeves looked up from the press, a slight man in his 60s, with ink-stained hands and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Holloway, he said, not surprised, which meant the news had traveled as news always did. I need your help, Wyatt said. He wasn't a man who said that easily. He could hear it in his own voice, the roughness of it, the cost of saying it out loud. Reeves heard it too, apparently because he set down what he was doing and took off his work apron and said, "Close the door." Talked for 2 hours. Reeves listened the way a good listener does, without interrupting, without letting his expression get ahead of his thinking, without performing reaction. He asked questions only when he needed clarification. He let Wyatt tell it from the beginning. All of it, including the parts. Wyatt wasn't proud of the ways he might have handled things differently, the decisions he'd made without fully thinking through what they'd cost. When Wyatt was done, Reeves sat quietly for a moment. You don't have a judge's order against you yet, he said. No. When they get one, and they will get one, it will specify removal of the children to federal custody. He tapped the table slowly. The question is whether there's a legal counter-argument strong enough to take in front of a judge before that happens. Or simultaneously. Is there? Reeves looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. Been keeping records? Yes. Document the condition of each child upon arrival. Document what you've done since. Document every interaction with Forsyth, including today's. He paused. There are legal precedents, not many, not clean, but they exist for private guardianship claims, in cases where the welfare of the child can be demonstrated to be better served by an existing arrangement than by federal placement. Can that argument be made? Reeves took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, which was something Wyatt had noticed he did when he was thinking hard. It would require a judge willing to hear it. Not all of them are. He put the glasses back on. There's a circuit judge, Harlan Cavell, who comes through this district every few months. He has a reputation for being ornery, which in my experience means he doesn't like being told what the answer is before he's looked at the question. When does he come through next? 6, maybe 8 weeks. Forsyth won't wait 6 weeks. No, Reeves agreed, which means we need to file something in the interim that creates a legal pause. A formal petition for guardianship, even an informal one that gives Covell something to consider when he arrives. He looked at Wyatt steadily. This is not a guaranteed path, Holloway. I want to be clear about that. The federal government has authority that a circuit judge can't simply overrule, and you are one man with limited resources going against an institution with considerably more. I know, Wyatt said. Why are you doing this? The question was direct, not challenging, just real. Reeves was looking at him with the kind of attention that wanted an actual answer. Wyatt thought about Nora in his lap in the dark. He thought about Ethan's face in the yard when he'd said you could tell us to leave. He thought about the way 12 bowls had been washed and stacked after the first night. Because someone has to, he said finally. And I'm the someone who's there. Reeves nodded slowly. All right, he said. Let me write some things down. The ride back to the ranch was long and cold, and Wyatt spent most of it going over what Reeves had said and looking for the holes in it. There were holes he could see them clearly, the places where the plan depended on things that weren't guaranteed. A judge willing to hear it. Enough time before Forsyth returned with paper that couldn't be argued against. A legal argument that was plausible in a system not designed to see the children in his cabin as anything other than a category to be managed. He got home as the light was failing. The scene he walked into was not what he expected. The cabin was loud, not in the way of distress or trouble, in the way of ordinary, messy life. Sarah and two of the middle children were arguing about something to do with the bread that had apparently gone wrong at some point during the day. Dylan and Clay were in the corner, doing something with a piece of rope that they stopped doing very quickly when Wyatt came in, which meant it was probably something they'd been told not to do. 3 of the younger children were chasing each other around the table in a game that had no obvious rules. Nora was sitting on the floor next to the stove with a piece of charcoal, drawing on a flat piece of wood, careful, serious marks that she was studying with intense concentration. And in the middle of all of it, Ethan was standing with his hands on his hips, looking at Wyatt with an expression of someone who had been managing a situation all day and was glad to see reinforcements. Bread collapsed, Ethan said. I can see that. It wasn't my fault, Sarah said from across the room, firmly. It was nobody's fault, said a boy named Tomas, who was 9, and had apparently appointed himself mediator of the bread dispute. The bread is not important, Wyatt said. He looked around the room at the noise and the mess, and the 12 children who had spent the day living in his house and arguing about bread, like it was a normal thing to argue about, and something in his chest did something he hadn't planned for. He went to the stove and started making supper. He'd been gone most of the day, and they'd been managing without him, which they'd done adequately, but not brilliantly, because they were children, and that was appropriate. He cooked what there was, and they ate in the same shifts as always, crowded together, elbows bumping, the older ones helping the younger ones, small arguments breaking out and resolving and breaking out again. After supper, when the younger children were settling and the older ones were doing the tasks that had become their evening routine, Wyatt told Ethan about Reeves, told him about the petition and the circuit judge and the weeks they might have. Ethan listened without expression. Then he said, What do we do in the meantime? Keep doing what we're doing, Wyatt said. That's it? That's most of it. He paused. There's one more thing. Ethan waited. If Forsyth comes back before we've got the legal situation sorted, and he will come back, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that it goes badly, that whatever I do isn't enough. He kept his voice steady. That happens. If they come in with an order and there's nothing I can do to stop it, I need you to know that I'm not done, that I'll keep fighting through whatever legal process is available, that it won't be the end. Ethan looked at him for a long time, but they'd take the little ones. They might, Wyatt said. It was the hardest thing he'd said out loud since this had started. He could see it land on Ethan, not as a blow, exactly, but as a weight. The boy absorbed it, the way he absorbed everything difficult, not by denying it, but by taking it in and standing up under it. Nora doesn't do well with strangers, Ethan said. His voice was completely flat. She shuts down, stops eating sometimes. I know. James would fight back, and they'd hurt him doing it. I know. And Mara, he stopped. He pressed his lips together for a moment. You need to win, Wyatt. It was the first time Ethan had called him by name. It arrived without ceremony, just a fact, like the cold or the distance or the difficulty of everything they were dealing with. But it changed the quality of the room in a way that Wyatt felt without knowing how to describe it. I intend to, he said. The days that followed were the worst kind of waiting, the kind where you have things to do, but nothing you do feels like enough. And the doing of them is colored by the knowledge of what's coming. Wyatt kept working. He kept the ranch running, kept the cattle fed, kept the water lines from freezing. He kept the children in their routines because routine was a form of stability, and stability was what they needed more than almost anything. He also kept writing. Every day he added to the record what the children were doing, how they were progressing, what he'd observed about their health and their behavior and their learning. He wrote down the fact that James's feet had healed fully. He wrote down that Mara had figured out how to braid rope by watching Dylan and had then taught 2 of the younger girls how to do it. He wrote down that Nora had started talking more, not to everyone, not to strangers, but to him and to Ethan, and eventually to Sarah, small sentences that carried large meaning. He wrote down the chess games with Ethan and which one of them won, which was usually Ethan, and sometimes neither of them because they lost track of the rules in the middle and had to start over. He wrote it all down because Reeves had said documentation was power, and because some part of him understood that if it all fell apart, if Forsyth came back with his order and his riders and his cold, practiced voice he wanted, there to be a record that said these children had been here, had been known, had mattered to someone enough to write down the specific details of their days. 3 weeks after Forsyth's second visit, 2 things happened. The first thing was that Vernon Creel came to the ranch. He came alone and in daylight, which was at least better than coming with agents in the dark. He rode into the yard and stopped his horse and waited to be acknowledged, which was a level of courtesy Wyatt hadn't expected from him. Wyatt walked out to him and stopped at a conversational distance. Creel, Holloway. Creel looked at the expanded cabin at the recent construction. His expression moved through several things. Heard they came out, and you sent them off, temporarily. Creel was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the cabin windows, and Wyatt noticed him noticing the faces of the children who were watching from inside. My wife's cousin, Creel said finally. Without introduction or context, Wyatt waited. She runs a school up in Cowboy Valley for different kinds of children, kids who don't fit into the regular schooling arrangement. He shifted in his saddle. The movement was uncomfortable in a way that wasn't physical. She's been doing it for 6 years. She has connections with some of the legal people who handle cases like yours. Wyatt looked at him. Creel met his eyes and then looked away. I'm not saying I was right to tell Forsyth where to look. I'm saying I'm aware that I might have made things harder than they needed to be. You did, Wyatt said flatly. Yes, no argument, no decoration, just acknowledgement. They stood in the yard. One of the horses, Wyatt's, in the paddock, called out and then was quiet. Why are you here, Creel? Creel reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out. My wife's cousin's name, and the name of the lawyer she works with. He's filed cases like yours before. He paused. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just, he seemed to search for the word, adjusting. Wyatt took the paper. He unfolded it and read the names written there. This is in addition to what Reeves is doing, he said, mostly to himself. More help doesn't hurt, Creel said. He gathered his reins. For what it's worth, Holloway those kids in your window. They don't look like fugitives. They're not, Wyatt said. Creel nodded once. Then he turned his horse and rode out, and Wyatt stood in the yard, holding the piece of paper, and he thought that people were sometimes more complicated than the category you'd put them in, and that this was occasionally a useful thing. The second thing that happened was worse. Forsyth came back. Came back on a Thursday, in daylight this time, and he came with not 6 men but 9, and the man with the leather satchel was back, and this time the satchel was thicker. He also brought someone new, a man in a different kind of coat, who hung back slightly and had the look of law enforcement rather than government administration. They came into the yard and stopped, and Forsyth dismounted and walked to the door with the flat, certain movement of a man who had spent the intervening weeks arranging the pieces he needed. Mr. Holloway, he said, we have a federal removal order signed by a sitting federal magistrate. This order authorizes the immediate transfer of the following minors to federal custody. He held up the paper. You are legally required to comply. Any interference with this process constitutes obstruction of federal authority and is punishable under federal law. Wyatt stood in his doorway. Behind him, he could hear the cabin, could hear the absence of the noise that was usually there, the particular silence of children who understood that something was happening that required silence. Notsam sighing. He looked at the order. He looked at Forsyth. He looked at the 9 men in his yard, and the man who had the look of someone who would use force if it was required, and wouldn't particularly mind doing it. And then he stepped out of the doorway and stood in the yard. Reeves filed a formal petition for guardianship 2 weeks ago, he said. It's been received by the circuit court and is pending before Judge Harlan Covell. Forsyth's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. That petition doesn't... I know it doesn't override your order, Wyatt said. Filed, and it's real, and it's pending. Which means this removal doesn't happen in a quiet way that nobody ever looks at again. It happens on the record, in front of a judge who is already looking at it. He paused. You're a man who writes things down and sends them places. You know what it means when something is already in front of a judge. The man with the satchel leaned over and said something very quietly to Forsyth. Forsyth listened without taking his eyes off Wyatt. The silence in the yard was the thickest kind, the kind that comes when everyone present knows that a decision is being made and is waiting to see which way it goes. Then the door behind Wyatt opened. He turned, because he'd told them not to, had specifically told them to stay inside, and he felt the flash of frustration before he saw who it was and what they were doing. Ethan walked out first. He stood beside Wyatt and looked at Forsyth and the 9 men without speaking. Then Sarah came out, and she stood on Wyatt's other side. Then Dylan and Clay and the other older children, filing out one by one, arranging themselves in the yard in a line that was not aggressive, was not theatrical, was simply present. They stood in the February, cold without coats, because they'd come out quickly, and they stood still and looked at the federal agents with the absolute, unshakable attention of people who understood exactly what was at stake and had decided they were not going to watch it happen from behind a door. Last out was Ethan going back for Nora, who came out on his hip because she was too small to walk fast enough. She put her head on his shoulder and looked at Forsyth with those dark, tracking eyes of hers. Wyatt had told them not to come out. He was going to have something to say about that later. Right now he looked at Forsyth and waited. Forsyth looked at the line of children in the cold yard. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at the man with the satchel who was looking at something in his papers with the focused expression of a man doing math in his head. The petition, Forsyth said carefully. It's formally filed. Before a circuit judge already scheduled for this district, Wyatt said. Yes. Another long silence. A horse shifted. The wind moved. We cannot execute this order if it creates a direct conflict with an active judicial proceedings, the man with the satchel said quietly. He was speaking to Forsyth, but he wasn't trying to hide it. Forsyth stood in Wyatt's yard for a long moment. His face was controlled and closed and showed nothing of what he was deciding. Then he looked at Wyatt. When is Covell scheduled? He asked. 5 weeks, Wyatt said. 5 weeks was Reeves's estimate. It might be 6. It might be 4. He didn't know exactly, and he said 5 weeks because it sounded certain. Forsyth looked at the children. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at the order in his hand with the expression of a man who is holding the right piece in the wrong game. We'll be present for those proceedings, he said. That's your right, Wyatt said. Forsyth folded the order and put it back in his coat. He turned and walked back to his horse and mounted without looking at the children again. The 9 men turned their horses. They filed back down the approach road in the gray morning light, moving at the same controlled pace as before, and Wyatt watched them until the last of them disappeared around the bend. He stood in the yard for a moment. His hands were not shaking this time. He was past the point where they shook. He turned to look at the line of children beside him. I told you to stay inside, he said. None of them looked the least bit sorry. Ethan met his eyes. We know. Wyatt looked at them, all of them, in the cold. Without coats, having done the exact thing he'd told them not to do, and clearly having made the decision to do it together. Inside, he said. All of you. It's freezing. They went inside. He followed. He stood in the doorway for a moment after the last one passed him, looking at the empty yard, the empty approach road, the Montana winter spread out in every direction under a sky the color of old iron. 5 weeks. He had 5 weeks, and a legal petition that Reeves had done his best with, and the name of a lawyer from Creel's wife's cousin, and records he'd been keeping since December in his ranch ledger. He had a 14-year-old who had walked out of the cabin when he'd been told to stay in it, and 11 other children who had followed him, and a 4-year-old who'd come out on someone's hip to stand in the February cold because she'd decided that was where she belonged. Closed the door. He went to his chair and sat down and stared at the fire. Somewhere out there, a circuit judge named Harlan Covell was making his way through the territory, stopping in towns, looking at cases, deciding what the law meant in places where the law still had room to mean different things depending on who was asking. Wyatt Holloway, rancher, widower, man who had never wanted to be involved in anything larger than his 400 acres, was going to put 12 children's lives in front of that judge and ask him to see them as what they were. Not property, not fugitives, not a federal problem to be managed, family. He didn't know if it was going to be enough. He was going to find out. 5 weeks felt different from the inside than it looked from the outside. From the outside, from the position of someone watching Wyatt Holloway go about his days, it might have looked like ordinary life continuing on a Montana ranch in late winter. Feed, water lines to check, children to keep in routines that held them steady, meals 3 times a day, evenings by the fire. The chess games with Ethan that still ended in arguments about rules neither of them fully remembered correctly. From the inside, it felt like standing on ice and listening to it creak. Reeves came out to the ranch twice during those 5 weeks. He brought papers each time, documents he needed Wyatt to sign, clarifications he needed about specific dates, questions about the condition of individual children that would matter to the formal record. He was methodical and careful, and never once suggested that the situation was better than it was, which Wyatt appreciated. He had no use for false comfort. The lawyer, whose name had come from Creel's wife's cousin, was a man named Philip Adder, based 2 towns over in a place called Morrow Junction. Reeves had contacted him, and Adder had agreed to associate on the case, which apparently meant something legally significant. 2 voices where there had been 1, 2 sets of arguments, a broader claim. Wyatt had spoken to Adder once on the road between towns, a brief conversation that told him. Adder was the kind of lawyer who thought in terms of precedent and counter-precedent and could hold 6 legal threads in his head simultaneously without dropping any of them. You understand. Adder had said, near the end of that conversation, that even if Covell rules in your favor on the immediate question guardianship, right to remain, the federal authority doesn't simply evaporate. There will be conditions. Oversight, possibly. A long process. How long, Wyatt had asked. Years, Adder said, not unkindly, just accurately. Wyatt had nodded and said that was all right. He had meant it. Inside the ranch, the 5 weeks had their own texture. The children were not unaware of what was happening. The older ones certainly weren't, and even some of the younger ones had picked up enough from overheard conversations and the quality of the adults' silences to understand that something large was turning in the world outside the cabin wall. Wyatt didn't try to hide it from them. He didn't dramatize it either. When Ethan asked him direct questions, he gave direct answers. When Sarah asked what would happen if the judge decided against them, he told her he didn't know exactly, but that he would not stop trying. When James asked if they were going to be sent away, Wyatt looked at him straight and said, "Not if I can help it." He was aware that "not if I can help it" was not the same as no. James was aware of that too. The boy was 11 years old and had already learned the difference between promises and intentions, which was a piece of knowledge nobody that age should have to carry. But the night before the hearing, Wyatt couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. He hadn't slept well in weeks, but this particular sleeplessness had a different quality to it. It was not the restless, planning sleeplessness of someone working through strategy. It was the still, empty sleeplessness of someone who has done everything they can do and is now at the edge of what effort can reach. He sat in his chair in the dark. The fire was low. Around him, 12 children breathed in their sleep uneven rhythms, the small sounds of people who were resting without fully letting go of the day. He sat, and listened to them and thought about Clara, which he did sometimes in the quiet hours. Still, not with the raw grief of the early years, but with something quieter, a kind of acknowledgement. She would have known what to do in a room full of frightened children. She had been better at the human parts of things than he was. He was better at the practical parts. He had been doing his best with both, which was all anyone could do, and it had been insufficient in some ways and more than sufficient in others. He thought about the judge, Harlan Covell. He'd asked around about the man in the past weeks carefully, indirectly, through Reeves and Adder, who had more legitimate reasons to be asking. What he'd assembled was a picture of a man in his late 60s, appointed to the circuit some years before, with a reputation for taking an uncomfortably long time to make decisions and for being very unpleasant to lawyers who oversimplified things for him. He had ruled against federal overreach twice in the past 5 years, both times in cases involving property disputes where the government's legal position had been technically correct but practically excessive. He had also upheld federal authority in 4 other cases without apparent hesitation. There was no way to predict it. Reeves had said as much. Adder had said the same, in different words. Wyatt understood this. He was a man who spent his life working with variables. He couldn't fully control weather, cattle, markets, the particular stubbornness of frozen ground. He understood that you prepared as well as you could, and then you accepted the outcome. He was not entirely sure he accepted that right now, but he would manage. The hearing was in Halter Creek, in the largest room of the town hall, which was also used for public meetings and the occasional traveling entertainment. Covell had set it there, rather than requiring a trip to the district court, which was a choice that Reeves said meant something about how the judge was approaching it, though he couldn't say exactly what. Wyatt arrived early with Reeves and Adder. He left the children at the ranch with strict instructions, and with Cornwallis's wife, a practical woman named Beth, who had come out 2 days before to meet the children, and had spent 3 hours cooking with the older girls and teaching Nora a hand game she'd learned as a child herself. She had not asked Wyatt to explain his situation. She had simply shown up when Cord had asked her to, and had been exactly what was needed without making anything of it. The room filled up. This surprised Wyatt. He had expected a sparse official preceding the judge, the agents, the lawyers, the necessary clerks. What he got was Halter Creek showing up. Not all of it, not in any organized way, but a substantial portion of it, filing into the benches of the town hall with the quiet determination of people who had decided they wanted to be present for something. Cornwallis was there. Aldous Bream was there in his council capacity, and possibly also in a personal one. The sheep farmer from 2 valleys over, who had sold Wyatt the wool for the children's coat, was there sitting in the 3rd row with his hat in his hands. A handful of women Wyatt recognized from various interactions over the years were there, sitting together, with expressions that were not warm toward the federal side of the room. Vernon Creel was there too. He sat in the back, alone, and when Wyatt passed him on the way to the front, he gave Wyatt the same uncomfortable nod he'd given when he'd ridden out to the ranch, and Wyatt returned it with the acknowledgement it was due. Forsyth was there, with 2 of his men, and the clerk with the leather satchel, and a federal lawyer. Wyatt hadn't seen before a younger man with a precise, alert manner who had clearly done this kind of thing many times. They sat on opposite sides of the room and did not look at each other. Judge Harlan Covell arrived 7 minutes after the scheduled start, which might have been punctuality in a larger city and was practically early by frontier standards. He was older than Wyatt had expected, small and lean, with white hair and a face like old leather, and he moved with the deliberate care of a man whose joints had opinions. He took his seat at the table set up at the front of the room and looked out at the assembled crowd with an expression that suggested he was neither surprised nor particularly moved by the turnout. He had the papers. All of them Reeves's petition, Adder's supplementary arguments, the federal removal order, whatever the government's lawyer had submitted. He had apparently read them, because he didn't spend time reading them now. He just looked at the room. "We are here," he said, in a voice that was drier and quieter than Wyatt had expected, and somehow more commanding for it, to consider the matter of the Holloway guardianship petition and the federal removal order. This is not a criminal proceeding. Nobody is on trial. He looked at the federal lawyer. "You'll have your opportunity." He looked at Adder and Reeves. "So will you." He looked at Wyatt directly, briefly, with eyes that were pale and sharp. "And I'll hear from you as well, Mr. Holloway." Then he opened the proceedings. The federal lawyer went first. His name was Garrett Sims, and he was, as Wyatt had assessed from across the room, very good at this. He presented the legal framework with the efficiency of someone who had practiced it, the relevant statute, the federal mandate for the supervision of displaced indigenous minors, the documentation of the children's presence on the ranch without legal authorization, the fact of its failure to report their location to authorities. He was not aggressive. He was methodical, which was more effective than aggressive. He laid out the government's case the way you lay out tools before a job, each piece in order, each piece necessary. When he was done, Cowell asked him 2 questions. The first was about the specific facility where the children would be placed and what Sims knew of its current capacity and conditions. Sims answered with the practiced confidence of a man repeating information he'd been given. The second question was whether the federal government had made any attempt to contact Wyatt Holloway between November and February. Sims hesitated only briefly, but the room was quiet enough that the hesitation was audible. "The search for the children was ongoing," Sims said. "That's not what I asked," Cowell said. "No direct contact was made with Mr. Holloway until February." "Thank you," Cowell said, in a tone that made it clear that answers had landed somewhere in his accounting. Adder went next. He was thorough in a different way from Sims, less linear, more layered. He built the argument in rings, starting with the children's documented condition on arrival and moving outward through what Wyatt had provided, what the children's welfare required, what legal precedent existed for private guardianship in emergency circumstances. He cited 2 cases Wyatt had never heard of, in enough detail that it was clear he had read them fully, rather than summarizing from someone else's summary. He talked about the children as individuals by name, by age, by specific detail, which was Wyatt's contribution to the preparation, the records he'd kept in his ledger, now typed up and submitted as evidence. Cowell listened to all of it without expression. Then Cowell looked at Wyatt. "Mr. Holloway, come up." He went up. He stood at the front of the room and felt the weight of everyone watching him and thought about the fact that he was not a man who was comfortable being looked at, and that this was simply something he was going to have to be uncomfortable about. Cowell looked at him for a moment. "Why don't you tell me, in your own words, what happened?" So Wyatt told it. He told it the way he'd told it to Reeves, the way he'd gone over it in the dark nights of the past weeks, the way it had actually happened, without embellishment, without legal framing, without the kind of narrative architecture that Adder had built so carefully. He told it practically. He found the tracks. He left food. They came in out of the cold. He looked at what was needed and did what was needed, because that was what you did when something needed doing. He did not say it had been easy. He did not say he'd been confident. He said it had been clear to him from the beginning that these were children, and that children in that condition required help, and that he'd provided the help he had available, and that when it had become apparent that help was going to need to be more than temporary, he had tried to figure out how to make it more than temporary. "Did you know you were breaking the law?" Cowell asked. Wyatt considered the question, the way Cowell had apparently delivered his decision slowly, and then directly. I knew I was doing something the government would have an opinion about, he said. I knew I wasn't reporting to anyone. Whether that constituted breaking a specific law, I didn't know the specifics. I knew the specifics afterward, and knowing them afterward, I'd do the same thing, Wyatt said. The room was very quiet. You understand, Cowell said, that this proceeding has consequences regardless of what I decide today. That there are legal processes already in motion that don't stop at my discretion. I understand that, Wyatt said, and you're prepared for that. I'm prepared to keep fighting through whatever process is available. For as long as it takes, Wyatt said. Yes. Cowell looked at him for a moment, one of those long, measuring looks that the man seemed to deploy when he was deciding something. Then he said, "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. Sit down." Then something happened that Wyatt had not expected. Cowell looked at the room and said, "I understand there are individuals here who wish to speak to this matter. I'll hear from them briefly." Reeves had not told him this was possible. Adder had not mentioned it. Wyatt looked at both of them, and Adder gave him a small, controlled expression that said he was equally surprised. Cornwallis stood up first. Cornwallis, who had never asked Wyatt anything personal in 10 years of selling him supplies, stood up in the town hall of Halter Creek and said, in his deliberate, heavy-set way, that he had observed Wyatt Holloway operating in this community for a decade, that he was a man who paid his debts, kept his word, and did not create problems for his neighbors, and that in his personal opinion, the arrangement at the Holloway Ranch was working, and he saw no reason the government needed to involve itself in something that was working. Then the sheep farmer stood up and said much the same thing in fewer words. Then one of the women from the third row stood up, a woman Wyatt knew slightly, a homesteader from the next valley, whose name was Prudence Waite, and said that she had visited the ranch twice in the past month to bring some things she'd thought might be useful, and that what she had seen there were children who were fed, healthy, learning, cared for, and that she had visited a federally operated placement facility once in her life and knew what those looked like, and that there was a difference. Forsyth started to say something from his side of the room. Cowell looked at him, and Forsyth stopped. 3 more people spoke. None of them were dramatic about it. None of them made speeches. They said what they'd seen and what they thought, and then they sat down. Cowell listened to all of it. When the last person sat, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to take a recess and consider the matter. We'll reconvene in an hour." The hour was the longest Wyatt had experienced since the night he'd sat in his chair, waiting for dawn to come after Forsyth's first visit. He sat in the front bench with Reeves on one side and Adder on the other and didn't talk. Around him, the room moved, people stretching, going outside, coming back in. The federal lawyers conferred in their corner. Forsyth stood by the window with his arms folded, not talking to anyone. Reeves said once, very quietly, the people speaking that mattered. "How much?" Wyatt said. "I don't know," Reeves admitted, "but it mattered." Adder said nothing. He was looking at his notes. Then he put his notes away, which told Wyatt that the notes were no longer the relevant thing. When Cowell came back, the room settled faster than it had any right to. The judge sat down, arranged his papers, and looked out at the assembled room with those pale, sharp eyes. "I want to say something before I get to the substance of this," Cowell said. "I want to say it clearly, because I think there is a version of this situation that various people in this room may be inclined to oversimplify, and I am not interested in oversimplification." Paused. Mr. Holloway broke the law. Not dramatically, not maliciously, but he did. He concealed the whereabouts of minors under federal jurisdiction, and he maintained that concealment for months. That is a fact, and I will not pretend it isn't. He paused again. The federal government also failed in its responsibilities. The circumstances by which 12 children came to be surviving, alone in the mountains of Montana in November, were not Mr. Holloway's creation, and the government's response to those circumstances, which was to send agents to remove the children from the first stable situation they had encountered, without so much as a site visit, without any assessment of their current condition or welfare, based entirely on jurisdictional authority, That response is not something I can characterize as adequate. The room was very still. The law, Covell continued, is meant to serve people, not the other way around. When it operates the other way around, it requires someone to stand in the room and say so. That's what I'm here for. He looked at his papers. I am granting the petition for provisional guardianship. Mr. Holloway will be recognized as the provisional guardian of the 12 named minors effective immediately, pending formal proceedings, which will be required under territorial law. He looked at the federal table. This does not terminate federal jurisdiction. There will be requirements documentation, review, a formal process that Mr. Holloway will need to complete through appropriate legal channels. That process will take time and will require cooperation between this court and the relevant federal offices. He looked at Forsyth. I expect that cooperation to be genuine rather than obstructive. Is that understood? Forsyth's face showed nothing. Understood, Your Honor. Covell looked at Wyatt. Mr. Holloway, you've created a complicated situation for yourself. Yes, sir, Wyatt said. The process ahead of you is not short, and it will not be simple. There will be requirements placed on you that you may find inconvenient. You will need to demonstrate on an ongoing basis that this arrangement serves the welfare of these children. Do you have any reservations about those conditions? Wyatt thought about Nora in his lap in the dark. He thought about 12 bowls washed and stacked. He thought about Ethan, walking out of the door he'd been told to stay behind. No, he said, I don't. Covell held his gaze for a moment. Then we're done here for today. He stood. Court is adjourned. The sound that moved through the room afterward was not quite cheering. It was too mixed for that, too aware of the complexity of what had happened. But it was present and warm, and it moved through Wyatt like something being released. Reeves gripped his arm once. Adder closed his briefcase with the controlled satisfaction of a man who had won a round he wasn't certain he'd win. Across the room, Sims was gathering his papers with the expression of a man who had not lost as badly as he might have, but had not won either, and who was already thinking about the next step in a process that was not going to end today. Forsyth did not look at Wyatt. He moved toward the door, with his men behind him, unhurried, and when he reached the doorway, he paused for just a moment, not looking back, just pausing, and then he went out. Wyatt stood in the emptying room and let the day sit on him for a moment. Aldous Bream passed him on the way to the door and stopped. They looked at each other. You should have told me more, Bream said. Probably, Wyatt agreed. I might have been more useful. You might have. Wyatt paused. You might not have been. Bream considered this. He had the look of a man conducting an uncomfortable accounting of his own behavior. Fair, he said. Then he put on his hat and went out. The ride back to the ranch was the first time Wyatt had felt the cold in weeks, actually felt it, registered it, instead of just enduring it. He noticed the way the late afternoon light was starting to change, slightly, the barely perceptible shift that came in late February, when the worst of winter had passed its midpoint, and the days were fractionally longer than they'd been. It wasn't spring. It wouldn't be spring for a long time, but it was something. When he came into the yard, he was halfway off his horse before the cabin door opened. Ethan came out first, because of course he did, and behind him came the rush and noise of 12 children, discovering that waiting was over. Beth Hallis had apparently not been able to prevent the stampede, and had given up trying. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded, and a look on her face that said she approved of the chaos, even if she wasn't going to participate in it. The younger ones reached him first because they ran without calculating distance. Nora hit him at knee height and held on. Two of the younger boys grabbed his coat. Mara was saying something he couldn't hear because everyone was saying something he couldn't hear. It was loud and disorganized and completely impossible to manage. He stood in the middle of it and let it happen. Ethan reached him last. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for a conversation, far enough to be composed, and looked at Wyatt's face and read what was there. Provisional guardianship, Wyatt said. It's not finished. There's a process, and it's long. Ethan's face moved through several things, but we stay. You stay. Something happened in Ethan's eyes that he managed, almost entirely, to keep off his face. He was 14, and he was practicing being the kind of person who kept things off his face, and he was getting better at it. But he wasn't all the way there yet. Okay, Ethan said. It was the smallest possible word for what it was carrying, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. Wyatt looked down at Nora, who was still attached to his knee with both arms, and showed no signs of letting go. Inside, he said, "It's cold." They went inside. The evening that followed was loud in the good way, the way it had been getting, over the months, as the children had settled into the ranch, and the ranch had settled around them. Supper was made with the additional participation of Beth Hallis, who had been cooking with the older children all day and had strong opinions about how the onions should be cut, which Sarah also had strong opinions about, and the dinner was the result of a negotiation that Wyatt stayed out of, and which produced something that was actually quite good. After supper, after the younger children were in their rooms, and the fire had been built up. For the night, Wyatt sat at the table with his ledger open in front of him. He looked at the pages of records he'd been keeping, the dates, the observations, the specific details of specific days. He looked at all of it. Then he turned to a new page and wrote the date. He wrote what had happened in the town hall. He wrote Covell's words as closely as he could remember them. He wrote provisional guardianship, and then the conditions that came with it. Then he wrote something he hadn't planned to write. He wrote 12 children, all present, all well, and then he sat for a moment looking at that line. He thought about the long process ahead, the formal proceedings, the federal oversight, the documentation requirements, the years Adder had mentioned. He thought about Forsyth, who had not conceded, and who would be present for whatever came next. He thought about the many ways this could still go wrong, and the many things he still didn't know how to do, and the large gap between where they were now and where they needed to eventually be. He was not a man who lived in the future. He lived in the day he was in and dealt with what was present. This had always been his particular strength and occasional weakness, and he had made his peace with it, closed the ledger. From the sleeping rooms, he could hear the sounds of children, settling small voices, the shuffle of blankets, a brief argument that resolved itself. The stove made its small sounds. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against the walls and found them solid. Put out the lamp and sat for a while in the dark. Not because he was sad, not because he was afraid, but because something had ended today, not the whole of it, not the process, but a particular chapter of it, and he was the kind of man who needed a moment to acknowledge when a thing had changed before he moved on to whatever came next. He thought about the morning he'd found the tracks. He thought about how close he'd come to reaching for the rifle instead of going back inside to get the food. He sat in the dark with that thought for a while, and he was grateful not to anything in particular, just in the general direction of things that had gone the way they had, instead of the way they could have. And then he went to bed. He slept for the first time in weeks without waking. It was not peaceful sleep, exactly. He was not that different from who he'd always been. He still had the same bad habits, the same limited patience, the same difficulty with words when feelings were what was required. He still burned the coffee sometimes and argued with Ethan about chess rules and said the wrong thing when the right thing would have cost him nothing. But in the morning when he woke, the ranch was still standing and 12 children were still in it, and the work that needed doing. He got up and started the fire, and then went out to check on the cattle, and the day began the way days did on a working ranch, not with ceremony, not with clarity about what any of it meant in the larger sense, but with the immediate and specific demands of a life that was, whatever else it was, unambiguously real. Process, as Adder had promised, was not short. It moved the way rivers move under ice. In late winter, you couldn't always see it happening, but it was happening, grinding and shifting beneath a surface that looked still. There were filings and hearings and correspondence and requirements, and each one led to another in the particular way, of legal systems that are designed less for resolution than for thoroughness. Wyatt dealt with all of it the way he dealt with difficult terrain, one step at a time, looking at the ground directly in front of him, rather than at the full distance still to cover. Adder was good at his job. Reeves was good at his. Between the two of them, they managed the legal machinery with a competence that Wyatt appreciated and could not have replicated, and was honest enough with himself to admit he couldn't have replicated. His contribution was the records, which turned out to matter more than he'd expected. Cavell had asked for monthly documentation of the children's welfare as a condition of the provisional guardianship, and Wyatt produced it detailed, specific, factual, and each report went into the legal file, and each one added weight to the argument that the arrangement was working. Forsyth appeared twice more in the months after the initial hearing. The first time was a formal review visit, 2 men from his office, clipboards, questions for Wyatt and for Ethan and for Sarah, a walk through the expanded cabin, a look at the ledger records. They stayed 4 hours and said very little and left without telling Wyatt what they'd concluded. He found out later from Reeves that the review had been submitted to the federal office with a notation he would not have expected from Forsyth's people, that the children appeared healthy and integrated into a functioning domestic arrangement, that no evidence of neglect or harm had been observed, and that the facility placement originally intended had since been found to be operating at reduced capacity due to a funding dispute. That last part was not something Wyatt had known, and it changed the shape of the federal argument in ways that Adder said were significant. The second time Forsyth appeared, he came alone. He rode into the yard on a Tuesday in April. The snow was going by then, the mud season that followed winter on Montana rangeland in full disagreeable effect, and he came without the leather satchel man and without the riders, just himself on a horse, which was different enough from every previous visit that Wyatt came out of the barn and stood in the yard and waited to see what kind of visit this was. Forsyth dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post and looked at the cabin and then at Wyatt. "I'm not here officially," he said. "All right," Wyatt said. "There's going to be a final determination," Forsyth said. "The formal guardianship petition. It'll go before Covell in about 6 weeks. My office has submitted its position." Wyatt waited. Forsyth looked uncomfortable in a way that the man had never looked before, not uncertain about his authority, but uncertain about something else, something personal maybe, or something that existed in the space between what the job required and what he thought privately. "I'm not going to tell you what our position is," he said. "That wouldn't be appropriate." "Then why are you here?" Wyatt asked. Forsyth looked at the cabin again. Through the window, the glass Wyatt had replaced in January with a better piece. 2 small faces were visible watching them. He looked at them for a moment, then back at Wyatt. "I've been doing this work for 11 years, Forsyth said. "I've removed a lot of children from a lot of situations. Most of those situations were bad enough that removal was the right answer." He paused. "Not all of them." Wyatt said nothing. "There was a case," Forsyth said. Stopped again. He was not a man who talked about himself easily. Wyatt recognized that quality because he shared it. "Few years back, a family. I did what the order said to do, and I watched what happened afterward, and He pressed his lips together. "It wasn't right. What happened after wasn't right." The yard was quiet. Somewhere inside the cabin, Nora's voice drifted through the glass, not words, just the particular tone she used when she was explaining something at length to someone who may or may not have been listening. "I'm not asking for anything," Forsyth said. "I'm not here to negotiate or compromise official proceedings. I'm here because he stopped a 3rd time. Because I drove out here, and I don't entirely know why, and I'm going to ride back now." He untied his horse. Wyatt watched him put a foot in the stirrup. "Forsyth." The man looked back. "You did your job," Wyatt said. "Through all of it, you did what the job required. I understand that." Forsyth looked at him for a moment. It was not a simple look. It had layers in it that Wyatt didn't fully understand and didn't try to. "Good luck," Forsyth said. Then he mounted and rode out. Wyatt stood in the mud of his yard and watched him go, and thought about what it meant to be a person who did a difficult job for a long time and had to live inside the decisions the job had required. It was not a comfortable thought. He didn't try to resolve it into something neater than it was. He went back to the barn and finished what he'd been doing. The 6 weeks before the final hearing were different from the 5 weeks before the first one. The first time, the waiting had had the quality of ice brittle, dangerous, every hour an exercise in controlling fear. This time the waiting was more like the mud season itself, unpleasant, slow, something you moved through rather than over, but not dangerous in the same way. The ground under it was firmer than it had been. The ranch had also genuinely changed by April in ways that Wyatt had not planned and could not have predicted. Ethan had taken over the cattle rotation almost completely, not because Wyatt had handed it to him, but because Ethan had learned it thoroughly enough and reliably enough that one day Wyatt had looked up and he hadn't checked the rotation himself in 2 weeks because he hadn't needed to. He'd told Ethan this directly because the boy had earned being told directly. Ethan's had said, with the minimal expression he used when something mattered more than he wanted to show. "I know what I'm doing." "You do," Wyatt agreed. Dylan had turned out to have a mechanical aptitude that expressed itself in a thorough fixation on anything that could be taken apart and put back together. Wyatt had caught him disassembling one of the barn hinges at the end of January and had been prepared to say something sharp about it before he'd noticed that Dylan was also reassembling it correctly from what appeared to be memory. He'd bought the boy a set of basic tools instead. Clay, who was quieter than Dylan and more observant, had become without anyone planning it the person the younger children went to when something was wrong. Not Wyatt, not Ethan, not Sarah. Clay. He had a stillness to him that was different from Ethan's controlled steadiness. It was more like water than like stone, and small frightened things moved toward it, the way frightened things always move toward calm. Sarah had opinions about everything, and was right about most of them, and was learning slowly that being right and being heard were two different skills that sometimes required different approaches. She and Wyatt had argued more than once about this, and the arguments were usually unresolved but always honest. And he thought, though he would not have said it, this way that the honesty was itself worth something. Mara had started teaching the younger children a language she said was partial pieces of something she'd learned from her grandmother before everything fell apart. She did it informally, in the evenings, as a kind of game that the younger ones thought was entertainment, and that the older ones understood was something else. Wyatt listened sometimes from his chair, catching fragments he couldn't understand, but recognizing them by their sound as something that belonged to the children, in a way that the ranch, the territory, and the whole frontier world around them did not. He had started to understand by April that what he was keeping alive in this house was not just 12 children. It was 12 children who were also the containers of things, languages, memories, ways of knowing, that would disappear if the children disappeared. He was not equipped to fully understand what that meant or what his role in it was, but he understood it enough to take it seriously. James, whose feet had healed completely in January, had become the one who checked the fence line every morning. Taken the job without being asked for it, simply begun doing it, and he did it with such consistency that Wyatt had stopped thinking of it as James's assigned task and started thinking of it as James's fence line. When a section came down in a March storm, James had come to tell Wyatt about it with the specific, accurate description of where the damage was and what materials the repair would require, and Wyatt had looked at him, 11 years old, standing in the kitchen, giving him a maintenance report, with the confidence of someone who knew his information was good, and had thought, not for the first time, that the world was going to hear from this boy eventually. Nora had started talking to everyone. This development had happened gradually enough that Wyatt hadn't noticed when exactly it had shifted one day. He'd realized she was having a full conversation with Cord Halas's wife in the yard, unself-conscious and direct, and he'd stood there for a moment processing the fact that this was the same child who had not said a word to him for the first 3 days she'd been in his house. She still followed him in the mornings. He had stopped thinking of it as something that required accommodation and started thinking of it as just how mornings worked. The day of the final hearing was in May. May in Montana was the world deciding whether to be warm or not. It could still snow, did snow sometimes, but the light had changed, and the mud had dried, and the grass was coming up through last year's dead growth in that insistent, slightly desperate way of green things that have been waiting a long time. Wyatt rode to Halter Creek in the morning light with Reeves and Adder, and the ride had a different quality from every other ride he'd taken toward something difficult in the past 6 months. He was not calm, exactly. He had given up expecting calm from himself in situations like this, but he was steady. There was a difference, and it mattered. The town hall was fuller than it had been in February. Word had traveled not just through Halter Creek, but through neighboring valleys and settlements, and there were faces Wyatt didn't recognize sitting in the benches alongside the ones he did. Prudence Waite was back. The sheep farmer was back. Beth Hallis was there, having left the ranch in the care of her eldest daughter, who had agreed to stay with the children for the day. Sims was back on the federal side, and he had different papers this time, the final federal position, which Adder had seen in advance, and which he described to Wyatt as more nuanced than the original. Cavell came in and sat down and looked at the room, and then at his papers, and then he began. The legal proceedings took most of the morning. Sims presented, Adder presented. Reeves submitted the full documentation file, every month's record, every note Wyatt had kept, organized and indexed in a way that his original ledger scrawlings had not been. Cavell asked questions of both sides, more questions than the first hearing, and the questions were more specific about individual children, about concrete arrangements, about what the formal guardianship would require going forward in terms of education and welfare and documentation. At one point, Cavell asked about the cultural question. He asked it carefully, not as a legal point, but as a practical one. What provision had been made for the children's heritage, their language, their connection to what they'd come from? Adder turned to look at Wyatt, because this had not been in the prepared materials. Wyatt thought about Mara's evening lessons. He thought about the fragments of language he heard in the house and didn't understand. He thought about the careful way the older children maintained certain things, certain ways of doing things, certain observances, certain stories they told among themselves that they'd never translated for him because some things were not meant to be translated. Keep it themselves, Wyatt said. I stay out of the way of what belongs to them. Cavell looked at him for a moment. That's a more sophisticated answer than most people in your position would give. Just accurate, Wyatt said. The judge made a small sound that might, in a man less controlled, have been something approaching approval. When both sides had presented fully, Cavell sat for a moment in the particular stillness he used before speaking. I want to address something that isn't strictly in the legal record, he said. I want to address it because I think it's been operating underneath this entire proceeding, and it's better to say it plainly than to pretend it isn't there. The room was very still. The children in this case arrived in Montana in circumstances that were not of their making. The dissolution of the settlement from which they came, the manner in which that dissolution occurred, is a matter that is not before this court, and may not be before any court, which is itself a comment on the limitations of the system I operate within. He paused. Those children survived in winter conditions alone for 11 days. They were found by a private individual who had no obligation to help them, and who chose to do so anyway, and who has maintained that choice under considerable legal and social pressure for 6 months. He looked at his papers. Provisional guardianship has been demonstrated to serve the welfare of the children by every measure available to this court. The federal placement originally intended has been through no action of Mr. Holloway effectively withdrawn as an option. The children are documented as healthy, developing appropriately, and integrated into a functioning household. He looked up. There is no legal argument remaining for removal that serves the children's welfare rather than administrative convenience. He looked at Sims. I don't say that as a criticism of your office's position. I say it as a statement of where the law and the facts intersect in this particular case. Sims nodded once carefully. The petition for full legal guardianship, Covell said, is granted. Wyatt Holloway is recognized as the legal guardian of the 12 named minors, effective from today's date, subject to the ongoing documentation and welfare review requirements previously established and to be maintained for a period of 3 years. He looked at Wyatt directly, after which, if the record remains as it has been, those requirements will be lifted and the matter will be closed. He gathered his papers. This court is adjourned. What happened in the room after that was something Wyatt had no framework for and would not have been able to describe accurately afterward. People stood. People talked. Someone near the back of the room started something that might have been applause and then became uncertain about it and stopped. And the resulting sound was neither applause nor silence, but something in between that the room seemed to settle for. Reeves gripped Wyatt's arm. Adder closed his briefcase. Bream came forward from somewhere in the middle of the room and shook Wyatt's hand with both of his, which was more physical expressiveness than Wyatt had ever seen from the man. Sims crossed the room and stood in front of Wyatt for a moment. He looked as though he was deciding something. Then he extended his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Holloway." Wyatt shook it. "Thank you for doing your job the way you did it." Sims looked at him a brief, complicated look, and then turned and went back to his papers. The ride home was long, and Wyatt didn't hurry it. He rode at an easy pace and let the spring afternoon move around him and tried to absorb what had happened. He was not good at absorbing large things quickly. He had always needed time with them to turn them over, to find the shape of them, to fit them into the ongoing structure of a life. What he found, turning it over in the May light on the road back to his ranch, was this: that he had been a man defined for 4 years by what he had lost, and that somewhere in the past 6 months he had become a man defined by something else entirely, and that the shift had not announced itself and could not be given a precise date. It had just happened, the way most real things happen gradually, and then, completely. He thought about the stone on the ridge with Clara's name on it. He still went there sometimes, still sat with it. He did not believe that stopped being appropriate just because his life had changed. The grief had not ended. It had become a different shape, quieter, more integrated, less like a wound, and more like a scar that told a true story about where you'd been. But he was not in that grief right now. He was on a road in May, riding home to a ranch full of children who were going to be unbearable about the outcome of today, because they had all been pretending very hard for the past 6 weeks not to be as frightened as they were. Came into the yard, and Nora was already at the fence before his horse had fully stopped, which meant his presence watching the road brought someone from lead for the past hour, at least. "Well," she said. She was 6 now. Her vocabulary had expanded considerably in the past months, and she deployed it without hesitation. "Well," he said, dismounting. "Well, what?" she said. "You're staying," he said. She looked at him with the solemn, tracking eyes she'd had from the beginning, and he watched her absorb this information, watched her face move through several things quickly, the way a sky moves through weather, and then she turned around and ran back to the cabin door and shouted something he couldn't fully make out, and the sound that came back from inside the cabin was immediate and loud and formless in the way of sound that is feeling first and words later. He led his horse to the paddock and took care of it before going inside, because the horse needed taking care of, regardless of what else was happening. This took 10 minutes. He could hear the cabin the whole time. His time. When he went in, the scene was the usual chaos with extra volume. Sarah was crying in the specific way she cried when she was relieved rather than sad efficiently, with irritation at herself for doing it. James was telling Dylan something rapid and technical about what the legal guardianship meant that was mostly accurate and slightly wrong in the details, which Wyatt corrected briefly as he passed. Clay was in the corner with 3 of the youngest children piled on and around him, apparently explaining something in his calm, water-still way that was making the small ones settle even in the middle of everything. Ethan was standing by the window. Wyatt went to him. They stood side by side looking out at the yard, the paddock, the ridge beyond with its line of pines. Done, Ethan said. The guardianship is final, Wyatt said. 3 years of documentation requirements, and then it's closed. Ethan nodded slowly. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was holding something carefully. 3 years, Ethan said. He'd be 17 by then, nearly a man by any frontier standard. 3 years, Wyatt confirmed. They stood quietly for a moment. Outside, one of the cattle in the far pasture called out for some reason of its own. There's something I've been meaning to say, Ethan said. Wyatt waited. When I walked out that door, when Forsyth was in the yard the second time. Ethan looked at the window rather than at Wyatt. You told us to stay inside. I did, Wyatt said. I know, he paused. I'd do it again. Wyatt looked at the side of the boy's face. He thought about what it had looked like from the outside, 12 children filing out into the February cold, because they'd decided that where they stood mattered. Thought about Forsyth's face when he'd seen it. He thought about what it had done to the calculation in the yard that morning. I know, Wyatt said. It was the same acknowledgement Ethan had given him months ago when Wyatt had said you did well. Not gratitude, not sentiment, just two people confirming that they understood each other. You should eat, Wyatt said. Whatever's on the stove smells like Sarah's been managing it, which means it's either very good or a problem. Ethan's mouth did the thing that was close to a smile. It's both, he said. It usually is. They ate supper that night in the particular fullness of a household that has been waiting for something for a long time and is now cautiously allowing itself to not be waiting anymore. It was not a celebration in any formal sense. There was no ceremony. Food was good, Sarah's thing had resolved in the better direction, and the younger children were allowed to stay up later than usual, which they understood was a concession without being told explicitly why it was being made. At some point in the evening, Mara started one of the songs she did sometimes low, not quite private, in the language that Wyatt didn't understand. 2 of the other older children joined her, and then one of the younger ones who had been learning from the evening sessions. It moved around the room in pieces, the way songs do when they belong to more than one person, and Wyatt sat in his chair and listened to it and did not try to understand the words, because the words were not for him. The sound was for him. The fact of the sound in his cabin was for all of them. He thought about something he'd said to Ethan in the early weeks, that he'd done it because someone had to, and he was the someone who was there. He'd meant it when he said it, and he still meant it now. But he understood by this point that it was also incomplete. He hadn't just been the someone who was there. He'd been changed by what he'd chosen to do when he was there. The man who had found the tracks that November morning, and the man who sat in his chair listening to a song in a language he couldn't understand, were the same man in the way that ground, before and after water, are the same ground, shaped by something that moved through and kept moving. He did not know what kind of man he was now, exactly. He was still not patient. He still burned the coffee and lost his temper occasionally, and said things that required apologizing for afterward, and the apologizing never got easier. He was still not natural with words, when feelings were what was required. He still missed Clara with a specificity that hadn't dulled into generality, the way people sometimes told you grief eventually did. He was also the man that Nora followed in the mornings, and Ethan played chess with badly, and James reported the fence line to, and Sarah argued with, and Clay watched from the corner with his still water-steady eyes. He was, in the specific and improbable, and not particularly graceful way of real things, a father. The 3 years of documentation requirements passed. They passed the way any sustained effort passes in the individual days of it, each one demanding something specific, most of them ordinary, some of them hard. Wyatt produced his monthly records with the consistency he brought to everything on the ranch. Adder submitted them. The periodic review visits, there were 4 of them over the 3 years, from a different office than Forsyth's, with a different manner came and went, without crisis. Children grew. Ethan turned 17 in the first year of it, and took on a formal role running the cattle operation that was different in name only from what he'd already been doing. By the second year, he was dealing directly with the buyers and suppliers that Wyatt had always handled himself. And he was better at the negotiations than Wyatt had been, because he had more patience and a sharper read of what people wanted to hear. Wyatt told him this once, and Ethan said, "I learned from watching what you didn't do," which was fair. James turned 14 in the second year and had by then fixed every piece of deteriorating fence on the property and started on the barn roof, which had needed attention for 2 years, and which he approached with the same systematic accuracy he brought to everything. Also started spending time at the Halter Creek blacksmith shop, which the blacksmith permitted because James had an aptitude the man recognized and didn't want to waste. Sarah left for 2 years. This was harder than Wyatt had expected, not because it was wrong, because it was clearly right, but because she was the first of them to go somewhere, and going somewhere was the first evidence that the world outside the ranch was going to keep pulling at them. She went to a small teaching college 3 days right away, admitted on the strength of a letter Reeves wrote, and her own performance on a written examination that the college had sent because they weren't sure what to make of her application. Came back in the summers. She came back permanently after her 2 years, though Wyatt understood by then that permanently was a temporary condition for her, and that the eventually of her leaving for good was a matter of when, rather than if. She opened a school in the valley 2 years after that. Clay left more quietly, which was consistent with everything about him. He went to work with a doctor in a town 40 miles east, not as a trained medical professional, but as the kind of steady, calm presence that doctors in remote territories often needed more than technical expertise. He came back for the summers too, initially, then less often, then for the particular occasions that required his specific kind of presence. Dylan stayed. He built things. He turned the barn into something structurally sound for the first time in years, and then started on improvements to the main structure that Wyatt had been thinking about for a decade and hadn't gotten around to. He was 23 years old and already had a reputation in the valley as someone whose work held. Mara married a man from the next valley. Over in the second year after the guardianship closed a quiet, careful man who had been around the ranch enough times on various errands that his feelings for Mara were known to everyone before they were known to him. The wedding was small. Wyatt walked her to it. He had not been asked to do this and had not offered to do it. Morris had simply appeared beside him that morning and said, "You're walking me," in a tone that did not invite negotiation. He walked her. The younger children grew in all the directions. Children grow into themselves, into their particular shapes, into the specific people that the early years of them had only suggested. Nora, who had held on to his knee in the yard and followed him in the mornings, and spoken her first word to him about pine trees, grew into a woman who was direct and serious, and occasionally still followed people around silently in the early hours of the day, as though she was still performing some important monitoring function. She took over Mara's evening language lessons. When Mara married, and she did it with more structure and more expectation than Mara had, because she was built differently, and the children she taught learned faster as a result. Wyatt did not plan any of this. He would like to be clear about that, in the accounting of his own life that he sometimes conducted late at night in the chair where he still sat. He did not have a vision of what the ranch would become or what the children would do with their lives. He had made one decision in November of 1887, standing at the edge of his tree line and watching a small girl walk toward him with a stick in her hand. He had made it for the reasons he'd given Reeves, because someone had to, and he was there, and because of the more honest reason he'd never said out loud to anyone, which was simply that he couldn't not. That some things were in front of you in such a way that looking away was its own decision with its own consequences, and he'd never been good at looking away. Everything else had followed from that. There is something that the frontier taught a certain kind of person, not the people who came to it with plans and vision and ideas about what it was supposed to be, but the people who stayed long enough for it to teach them what it actually was. The land itself was the teacher, cold and long and repetitive and indifferent to what you thought you deserved. Taught you that endurance was not glamorous, that doing the right thing rarely announced itself as such. It usually looked, from the inside, like just the next thing that needed doing. That the people you ended up responsible for were not always the people you'd planned on. That family was a thing you built with your hands and your time and your patience and your daily unglamorous presence. The same way you built a fence or a roof or an extra room off the side of a cabin in winter, because the cold didn't care whether you were ready. Wyatt Holloway was 61 years old, the last time he rode the full fence line of his property. His back was worse than it had been, and his horse was the third one since the gray he'd ridden. The morning, he found the tracks, and the ride took him longer than it used to. Did it anyway, because it was the fence line and it needed checking, and also because there was something about the ride that had always given him the clearest view of what the ranch actually was. Ethan rode out to meet him at the east corner, the way he often did in the late afternoon, when he knew Wyatt had gone out. They rode back together in the late light, the particular light of a Montana afternoon in early summer, that made even familiar things look like something else, something briefly more than what they were. "Nora's bringing her students out next week," Ethan said. "Wants to show them the cattle rotation." "She wants to show them," Wyatt said. "Or she wants them to help with the cattle rotation." Ethan's expression acknowledged this. Both, probably. Smart, they rode for a bit. "Letter came from Sarah," Ethan said. "She wants to know if we can send Dylan to look at the school building. Something structural, tell him," Wyatt said. "He'll go." More riding. The ridge was ahead of them, the pine line dark against the summer sky, the same ridge the children had come down from. In November of 1887, in their two big clothes and grass-stuffed boots, cautious as deer, carrying everything they had left between them. "There's a family," Ethan said. "Somebody mentioned to me in town. 3 children, no parents, living rough in the hills north of Cowboy Valley. County doesn't know what to do with them." Wyatt looked at the ridge, thought about tracks in the snow, about food left at a woodpile, about the specific weight of a 4-year-old falling asleep against your chest when you hadn't planned to let anyone get that close again. He thought about what any of it had cost him and what it had given him, and whether those two things could be put on the same scale and compared, and concluded, as he always concluded when he tried this particular accounting, that the scale was the wrong tool. Some things didn't go on a scale. They just were what they were, and you were what you were because of them, and that was the whole of it. "I'll ride up there next week," he said. Ethan looked at him sideways. He was not surprised. He had not been surprised when he mentioned it. "I'll come with you," Ethan said. "I know," Wyatt said. Came into the yard as the light went golden thin, and from inside the cabin, Wyatt could hear the particular sound of his house at the end of a day, the people in it going about the ordinary, unremarkable daily business of being alive and together. He stood for a moment in the yard, with his hand on his horse's neck, and listened to it. There were people who would look at his life and see what he had given up, the simplicity, the solitude, the clean edges of a life that belonged entirely to himself. There were people who would look at it and see what he had gained, and arrange it into something that sounded like a lesson or a parable or a story about the goodness of selfless acts. He didn't see it that way. He'd never been a selfless man. He'd been a man who had looked at something in front of him and been unable to look away, and who had discovered, in the process of not looking away, that the life that resulted was more than the one he'd had before. Not easier. Not without grief or difficulty, or the particular grinding endurance that the land required. Not perfect in any sense that the word usually meant. Full. Full in the way that the cabin was full in the evenings, and the fence line was full of the work that kept the land together, and the ridge was full of pines that had stood through every winter the territory had thrown at them, and the sky over Montana in early summer was full of a light that didn't ask anything of you and gave you everything anyway. He led his horse to the paddock. He went inside. The door closed behind him, and the evening went on.